Hello, welcome to Vienna. I'm here for DSM Firmenich's Aqua Days. I'm Rob Fletcher. I'm the senior editor of the Fish site, and I'm very happy to be here today with Gurjan Nikolic, who is senior seafood analyst at Rabobank, I believe.
Correct.
And a well-known figure in this industry. Gurjan, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Good. And can you tell me a little bit about your role in your company for those not familiar?
Yeah. So I'm part of our global research team. We are almost 90 people worldwide, and our role is to support all of our internal decision making, which goes. There's a credit element to it. There is M&A element and many other engagements, also engagements with our clients. And my specialty is aquaculture, fisheries, and seafood worldwide. Okay. And I basically support our clients from New Zealand to Patagonia, from Alaska to China, and everything in between. We have a very large and diverse global portfolio of relationships and clients in the seafood industry.
Very impressive. It sounds like a lot of work. But you're well known for your presentations on aquaculture, on trends in the industry, and you tend to focus on salmon, shrimp, and fish meal in particular. And why do you focus on those three areas?
Good point. The global seafood industry in general is very fragmented. It's very difficult for corporate-focused investment bank. So I'm part of the wholesale part of the bank, which means that we really require a certain size of company for us to be able to engage. And large-size companies are primarily in the seafood industry found in salmon. There are some in fish meal. I actually also focus on the groundfish sector, but we don't make publications for that. Okay. But we have also clients in that industry. In the shrimp space, our approach is mostly through companies that are in the shrimp value chain, but not per se shrimp farming, because that tends to be too fragmented for us to be able to engage as a wholesale bank. But we work with the feed companies, processors, distributors, genetics players, let's say the rest of the value chain that also tends to be a bit more Western and populated by large companies.
And the Rabobank investing in those particular areas on the whole?
So we are a leading lender, for example, 14 of the largest 25 salmon farmers. We have a lending relationship with them. Okay. All the big, let's say, commodity players, feed companies, processors that are also part of our, let's say, client base. But we also have, let's say, venture capital teams, various venture capital teams that invest in startup companies with the technology profile. In this particular case, we don't follow the large-size company requirement. So we focus on small ones. We just invested, for example, in Viaqua, which is a vaccine company, and many others. So for that, let's say on the equity side, we can focus on smaller players.
Okay. Presumably, your data that you're gathering on the bigger sectors is very useful for those.
Especially data and relationships. To help small startup companies, it's very good if you can introduce them to large corporates that can be their clients or they can use their technology. So as a bank, we try to be a bit of a spider in the web and try to know what are the business models of everyone and how they can combine and how they can benefit from each other. So as a sector specialized bank, like there are different, most banks would do every sector, but we only do food and agribusiness. And because we are super specialized in that one global niche, we tend to have a high market share, but also a very long long-term relationships. And those are quite valuable when you want to help small companies.
Okay, very good. And you're here in Vienna. You've been talking about your classic three areas. You've got the salmon, you've got the shrimp, and you've got the fish meal. And just, yeah, I've just seen your presentation, very enjoyable, lots of good insights. And yeah, sorry, what are the, starting with salmon, what are the key and emerging trends in the sector at the moment, both in terms of volumes and in terms of prices?
Yeah, no. The key point is that after a period of really quite low supply, there is an inflection point happening really now in Q3, where the sector will enter into a new phase of mild growth. And to really understand this, we need to go back in time into the COVID period and realize that back then, quite a bit of salmon farming volume, in the case of Chile by freezing and then selling in the next year, in the case of Norway by keeping in the water longer, was shifted to 2021. That very high supply was very difficult to be matched in the subsequent 2 years. Consequently, we have this negative growth in 2022 and 2023. But now if you switch into an understanding of prices, that high supply in 2021 actually was a great victory with salmon. Okay. Because people moved from food service into food retail and learned how to cook salmon at home, which maybe for me and you looks very intuitive and simple, but apparently for a large part of the global population, especially in North America, this was a new thing.
Okay.
So they got comfortable with it. So in effect, the demand curve had shifted to that higher level. So it wasn't an oversupply situation, it was demand curve shifting. But now we couldn't supply that same volume for 2 years, which means prices shot up to unseen levels, really record prices for both the first half of 2022 and the first half of 2023. So hopefully with the normalization of supply growth, at least we shouldn't be seeing these price peaks.
Okay.
But we're not arguing that we're going to have cheap salmon. It's just not going to be extremely expensive as it was in those 2 periods.
So it's good news for consumers and good news for farmers to a certain extent?
Well, I mean, for consumers, they don't observe the volatility in such a great way because there is a retail price in between that has kept at least the view that the consumer gets more mitigated. The really great thing that has happened for consumers is the plethora of innovation that they have enjoyed in the last 2 years as the sector tried to keep them as customers. To create a very convenient, let's say, grab and eat kind of product to provide an alternative to going to food service. So as the food service opened up, the sector was extremely innovative at keeping the customer still at retail. So that innovation was, I think, where the consumers really benefited.
Okay. And it sounds like it's been traditionally quite cyclical, the salmon sector, in terms of prices, but they seem to be having a pretty good time of it for quite an extended period now. But are there any uncertainties on the radar? Are there particular things that the salmon sector maybe should be a bit more worried about?
Yeah. I mean, there are a number of things. First of all, we have El Niño coming. And we are definitely in an El Niño year, and it might even be quite a hot El Niño. Really, we don't know at the moment. The winter of 2023 is likely to be the peak of the El Niño, at least by current meteorological expectations.
That's our winter or the Southern Hemisphere winter?
Our winter.
Our winter, okay.
But then in the Summer Hemisphere, that's going to be the summer. Mm-hmm. So imagine the potential for algae blooms. So that's the one we need to worry about. Okay. Whether the Chilean industry will have a heightened risk, that's one. The other one, I think the salmon industry will have to deal with a lower availability of fish oil.
Okay.
Fish, as you know, the Peruvian industry was canceled. The Peruvian fishery, the first Peruvian fishery of 2023 was canceled. And that...
Can you just explain the impact of that to our readers, for those who don't know?
Yeah, so Peru is the world's largest producer of fish meal and fish oil. In case of fish meal, it represents around 40% of traded volume. So it is the price setter. Now, fish oil prices were already high because of the very high price of competing vegetable oil alternatives, such as rapeseed oil and others. But this cancellation has created unseen price levels in fish oil. If you think about 2 years ago, we might have been looking at prices around $1,800 per ton. We are now at $6,500. There's a 300% increase in a 2-year period, and that increase is first based on high prices of alternatives, but now compounded by scarcity of fish oil. So the salmon industry really needs to find a way how to innovate in the feed formula and make sure that the feed formula is still as effective, as healthy, and also the salmon product itself has enough omegas to itself be perceived as healthy. There's like 2 points that they need to figure out, whether they're going to do it with alternatives or with some other methods. It's certainly a challenge for the sector.
Okay, so it could potentially be a good time for an alternative ingredient producers.
Exactly. I think the current crisis in Peru, if you can call it a crisis, I mean, it's a natural development, but it is a crisis for the people involved, just adds even more urgency for the industry to embrace alternatives. The fact is, however, that these alternatives are still not available. They're not available in the required volume. We need 50 to 100,000 or even 200,000 tons of fish oil for salmon to, let's say, to salmon to include fish oil in the required amount or even more. And I think the availability of alternatives is probably less than 30 or 40,000 at the moment.
Okay.
So it's
a tiny percentage.
It's a very small percentage. Yeah. It is a fact also that many of the leading companies in this sector are now scaling up. And the high price is allowing them to scale up profitably. So when the prices were low, it was difficult for them to justify large capexes when they don't know whether there's going to be demand for their product, because they are quite a lot more expensive than 1,800.
Yeah.
But in a 6,000 price world, they're definitely profitable. So now you see how capital is flowing into these projects, and hopefully, this inflow of capital will create supply growth probably 2-3 years from now, right? It doesn't happen that fast.
Yeah. Takes a while to scale up.
Yeah.
Okay. And what about, are there any political uncertainties facing the salmon sector?
Yes, there are. There are, as always. Of course, the Norwegian industry is very, very profitable, which we've all observed, and we've all been, it's been an example to the world of their profitability. But this profitability was also noticed by the Norwegian government. And without any, let's say, sustainability reason, but more of a equity distribution reason, they have greatly increased the tax rate. So the tax rate finally has adjusted from 22% to 47%, so an additional 25%. While it could have been worse, it could have been extra 40%, which was the original plan. Yeah. It's still a record tax globally, and it's basically a distribution of. You're taking away capital from a growing, profitable, innovative sector and moving it into the government. Yeah. many people will argue that that would be long-term value destructive, and that it's what the government in Norway is now fighting, and they've cancelled many growth projects, and also there is an impact on the auxiliary industry in Norway. Many companies who rely on the salmon industry to invest in everything from processing plants to wellboats, to move into post-smolt or develop the offshore industry, all of this now has slowed down. And we have to wait until 2025. That will be the next point when there could be potential change.
Okay.
And then we are working with basically two scenarios. Scenario A is a new government, the law gets changed, so perhaps the new law, when it comes, maybe 2026, will reverse the situation, and then you'll have back capital growing into these auxiliary sectors. Mm-hmm. Or it is as it is now, and then what you realize that to reduce the tax burden, investment in some of these auxiliary segments in innovations might actually be profitable. Okay. But we have to wait and see.
Okay.
But it's a very volatile, unpredictable moment, very challenging for a sector that needs predictability.
Yeah, yeah. So it'll be a minimum of 24 months that they'll be hit with this tax.
Oh, at least, yeah. At least. Even if the new government comes, it's not going to change the tax right away. It takes a while for this to happen.
Yeah. Wow. So yeah, mainly good news for salmon, but at least two major issues potentially on the horizon.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just moving on to shrimp. What are the key trends there? I mean, obviously.
So shrimp is it's interesting how it's the two big species in the global seafood industry. There are two big drivers of trade, two big drivers of consumption. Mm-hmm. Without these two species, the sector would be actually declining in consumption. But they're at a categorical opposite when it comes to their profitability. While salmon is an example to the world on how to maintain profitability in a myriad of challenges, both demand and cost, the shrimp sector is an example where pretty much no farmer at the moment makes money.
Right.
Maybe 85, 90% of the farming industry is currently selling at a loss on a per kilo basis.
That's on a global basis.
On a global basis. There are some very, very efficient companies, perhaps in Ecuador, that are still making money, but the current price point is even lower than the bottom of the pandemic.
Right.
So the challenge is severe, and it's interesting to see how the sector will, let's say, evolve out of this. How the invisible hand, if you will, how will it impact it? Unlike salmon, shrimp is a much more competitive sector. We describe the supply function as very elastic, while in the case of salmon, it's highly inelastic. It's really focused more on the biological side. So with an elastic supply curve, you both have high growth when the demand is good, but you should, in theory, have a decline in the supply when the prices are bad. Yeah. Now, why do I say this in theory? Because it's not exactly working in practice right now.
Right.
Some countries have already corrected. The case of Vietnam and Indonesia, we see double-digit reduction, above 20%. But India was very late with the response. And even later than that is Ecuador. And Ecuador is the biggest producer now in the world. And rightfully, they are more exposed to China, so they didn't quite experience the demand drop as fast as the others. But having said that, now over 80% of their industry is also below cost. But there's this underlying dynamic where those few profitable farms are owned by very large Ecuadorian companies that also have very large processing facilities. And they are using the current situation to invest in, let's say, more reasonably priced land
Okay.
in the region.
Okay.
And
So that's some farmers going out of business and potentially
some power farmers exiting the industry because they are below cost. That means that land becomes available for others. And that switch of ownership from a small farmer, and typically the ones that leave are the least efficient ones, when they are bought and developed by the most efficient ones, you have a productivity increase of somewhere between 300 to 400%. So that change can increase supply.
Yeah.
So Ecuador's growth has, in a way, prolonged the oversupply situation that we're in and the difficult price environment.
And then can it continue to grow? Are there any signs of it slowing down?
Well, yes, so we expect it will slow down. The most recent data in July was the negative growth for the first time.
Okay.
Even though the whole year they started with above 20% growth in January, which has been slowly coming down, and now we're beyond half-year mark, and now we have some negative numbers. We think probably for the whole year they might still end up averaging 12%. But having said that, the current export is negative in volume even. So there is also a response there, and hopefully that supply response together with an improving demand should get us out of this low price point. The question that we have about the demand, though, is that the low price at wholesale level has not yet passed through to retail products, or not fully.
Right.
And you cannot expect a great increase in demand if there is no low price for the product, if the product remains at a high point. Especially now, since in the West we have people going back to food service. So shrimp needs to innovate itself out of this, is to have a lower price. And also we depend on China, which is yet another unpredictable factor. Is China slowing down? And China has been a great buyer of shrimp.
Yeah.
So we still have a few uncertainties on the demand side that need to resolve before we come out of the trough, the price trough.
Okay. And how about El Nino? How will that affect the shrimp sector?
Yeah. Similar to salmon, there is an El Nino threat in Ecuador. A historical example of 1997 was that back then a strong El Nino created rains and flooding, and a large part of the Ecuadorian industry lost its shrimp and its farms during that period.
Okay.
Now, I understand that the current production is much more prepared, but still, we don't know how much of the sector is prepared. We don't know how strong the rains could be, what effect these could have on water quality. If there is a big drop in salinity, you can imagine the shrimp gets stressed.
Yeah.
You would need to adjust the pH in the water. You would need to adjust the feeding rates. There is a disease risk there.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're increasing their density. So it's just a higher risk factor that we need to consider.
Okay.
If that happens. And then also there is the cost element. We were all hoping that the shrimp industry would have a lower feed cost now.
Yeah.
Because soy meal prices have already come down. But as we all know, fish meal is now again more expensive, so that maintains that high feed cost price, which makes it very difficult for the sector.
Yeah, I mean, it's gone up. What? How much has the feed gone up? Do you think?
That's a very hard number to pinpoint.
Yeah.
I would say it hasn't gone up, but it has stayed high.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
it should have reduced,
Yeah.
given that the vegetable component is coming down in price.
Okay. Okay, but I mean, you're painting a very uncertain picture for the shrimp sector. But but I know you're in the longer term. You've always been very positive about it. How do you see it, sort of its longer term prospects?
Yeah, the good thing about shrimp is that we said it's a largely supply elastic sector, which means sooner or later they will follow the long-term demand growth. And if we've seen the pattern historically, it's been around 4.2, maybe 4 to 5% growth, which is quite a common
year-on-year
theme we see. Yeah, growth of supply was let's say the historical, and you can kind of assume that historical supply growth more or less follows demand, given that shrimp is such a supply elastic sector. Supply has less impact than like in the case of salmon. So if we project that type of growth into the future, I have no doubt that the sector will come back to that growth rate. Even if we have a contraction now, we'll come back to that growth rate. And that means that by 2030, we can probably get to 7 million tons or even more.
Wow.
Which it will add, 2 million from the current volumes that we have. But it will be a world where Ecuador and perhaps a few other Latin American producers will have a considerably higher producer share than the previous historical data, where Asians were the dominant producer.
So you're thinking we are fully in an era of Latin American dominance of the shrimp sector, potentially?
For the next few years, yes, they seem to be more efficient and capturing producer share. Unless the Asians find a way to reinvent themselves, to have some new business model, which is possible, they're suffering a market share loss for maybe a few more years.
Brilliant. And just to sum up, if you're thinking about people involved in these sectors or looking to invest in them or looking to learn about them, what would your sort of your concluding thoughts be on their prospects and where they're going to go?
Well, I mean, salmon and shrimp are the two leading aquaculture industries. That's where a huge amount of capital, but also technology flows into them. Just by their sheer size means that they will be the target of feed innovation, software, genetics, and a lot of things that we can learn also from the animal side. It will go into these sectors. So these sectors still have, especially shrimp, many low-hanging fruits to get better and improve, particularly on the mortality side. So if you combine, let's say, quite a bit of positive dynamics on the supply side with the very good demand function that both of these proteins have. They're healthy, they're sustainable. When processed, they're very easy to cook and eat. So both good for a Western consumer, but also good for an Asian consumer. They have no religious constraints and certainly don't have the same problems, let's say, that beef has with greenhouse gas emissions and land. So a lot of good things. There are a lot of good things about these two sectors. So we expect growth there. Now, on the fish meal side, of course, we don't expect growth. We expect volatility. Maybe a mean reverting volatility, because at the end the sector is fairly sustainable. But it's not enough to support a growing aquaculture sector. So we will need alternatives and considerable volumes of these. So that's where technology will play a role.
Good. Well, thank you, Goyan. Thank you very much for your time. Excellent insights, as ever, into these three sectors. We look forward to speaking to you again soon, I hope.
Pleasure is mine.
Good to see you.